coming up on Chopper's Brexit podcast.
The European Union has got to recognise as well, categorically now, that they have to make a big decision. We want to move from being a terraced house to being a fully detached house. But it doesn't mean to say we don't get on with our neighbours.
Hello and welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Coming to you as ever from the Red Lion pub right in the heart of Westminster. Before we start, do come and see us record a rare live podcast at Podcast Live in central London on Saturday, October the 5th. I'll be sitting down with Chairman of the European Research Group of Tory MPs, Steve Baker. Go to podcastlive.com for tickets and use the code CHOPPER10, all capitals, to get 10% off your tickets. I'll be milling around and would love to see some of you there. Right, on with the show. Now, on the face of it, it's been another difficult week for Boris Johnson. First of all, he was empty podiumed by the Luxembourg Prime Minister. And then Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU President, said there's a palpable risk the UK won't be able to strike a deal to leave the EU on October the 31st. And then the Finnish Prime Minister, who chairs the European Council, has given him till the end of this month to put down firm proposals about leaving the EU. And as if it wasn't bad enough already, just a few hundred yards from the Red Lion pub in the Supreme Court, Boris Johnson's lawyers are arguing that he did not mislead the Queen when he chose to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. Well, some would say he's had better weeks. But others might say all this chaos is designed to set the people against the elite in delivering Brexit. And joining me to unpack all this is Joe Moor, who until July was the Director of Legislative Affairs at number 10 Downing Street. Plus, I'll be sitting down with Chairman of the European Scrutiny Select Committee, Sibylle Cash. And finally, Miranda Green, the Deputy Opinion Editor of the FT, is with me in the Red Lion pub to report back on a weekend with Joe Swinton and the Lib Dems and why they think they might be the next party of government. But first up, I'm joined in the Red Lion pub by Ian Duncan-Smith, the former leader of the Conservative Party, who knows a bit about dealing with rebels over the European Union. Ian, welcome back to the Red Lion pub.
It's always good to be here.
How do we get there? How do we get to Brexit on October 31st? We're 6 or 7 weeks out.
I think, first of all, that the European Union is actually behind the scenes panicking and desperate. They know that they have to have a deal. They also know that extending is a very poor option for them because it creates the continuous chaos. So we hear a lot about the UK having chaos. The truth is, I know a lot of people who work in around the European Union, and they're all telling me nobody wants another extension, and they don't want to be forced by the British Parliament to have another extension. They want a deal. What they're desperate for is something on the table now. And I think they recognise they went in far too hard originally. They now have to be more flexible. So there is a certain sense, and Boris Johnson is right in this, there's a different mood now, but we have to put something on the table.
And that's why there's that pushback, wasn't there, in Berlin against Xavier Bettel's empty chairing in Luxembourg of the Prime Minister?
Yes, I thought Xavier Bettel did us all a massive favour. I mean, if Xavier Bettel hadn't existed and Luxembourg hadn't existed, you needed to invent them and him. And as inventions, they work brilliantly to scream and shout as a small little tax haven at the 5th largest economy in the world with the greatest global reach. Isn't just cheeky, it's just downright discourteous and insulting. And I think the one thing that would have really annoyed Mrs. Merkel and co. is you don't treat nations like that. Otherwise, you just make the point that the European Union disregards democracy and disregards nations. So he's done us a favour, and I think he's brought a lot of attention internally as to what the hell are we doing.
And the shape of a deal is emerging, isn't it?
Yes.
Overnight, Wednesday to Thursday, the DUP leader Arlene Foster met with Leo Varadkar in Dublin to discuss a deal. Clearly something's happening there. And you've got this idea of an agri backstop for agri-goods only in the island of Ireland, and everything else means we're out. So are you happy with the way it's looking at the moment?
Well, I don't know what they're doing. I have spoken to them, and
Them being?
The government. I've spoken to them about what they're doing. I think the key elements, there are two elements that are absolutely critical in this. whatever else we do, we must be protected in sovereign terms from anything that the European Union wishes to do while we're implementing the process of the deal. Article 4 in that withdrawal agreement is a disaster because it leaves the door open for them to say, right, we'll pile stuff in on them, particularly on
during the transition
on financial services, and then they'll have to obey that. And the other thing is existing ECJ rulings going on beyond well after we've left are also unacceptable. So that bit also has to be dealt with in the course of any deal, as well as saying, look, we use the wrong language in this. It's not about getting rid of the backstop. It's about changing what is a backstop. I think the truth is you need to make it a legal backstop, which says we both take responsibility for what's exported across our borders. And if stuff is exported in one direction, which is not meeting those regulations, then the EU or the UK, whichever is the originator, makes it an offence.
Would the structure as described there, with this agri backstop in the island of Ireland, mean we can do trade deals on whatever we want to do with America and the rest of the world?
Well, the two principles are that the Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and there must be nothing that allows that to separate, number one rule. Number two, we are going to be fully sovereign. Once we sign that treaty and go on the 31st, we must be fully sovereign. Everything else is secondary to that. Mm-hmm. And if we can't ask ourselves, are we sovereign in all matters, then we have done a terrible deal.
That's the question. Would you vote for the deal as it's coming up? You think?
Well, as I say, it depends on what they put on the table. I've discussed at length with them. I think there are ways to get through this that satisfies even the Brexit party. But the reality is, it is about being sovereign. At the end of it all, if we say that we are supreme and sovereign and we can make our own way and we can make our own decisions and we are not beholden to somebody else, then that's a good deal.
Is there a way back for the whipless 21 Tory MPs who were thrown out for supporting Jeremy Corbyn's attempt to take control of the order paper?
Well, I think they break up into different groups. I've always said, look, even though you have the whip taken from you, there must always be a way back. What is the way back? Demonstrate your loyalty to your government.
So Queen's Speech.
Queen's
Speech. The next big vote, isn't it?
Yeah. All votes now.
October 14th, all big,
a major point. All votes going forward now have to be supported. Otherwise, you no longer have the right to have that whip. I think there is a number of them that are desperate to get the whip back because they hadn't thought that they would lose it. I don't know why. There's another group at the other end, some of who have already disappeared, they don't care, and some who are retiring. People like Oliver Letwin I put into that category, who frankly think their job now is just to cause mayhem. So they're not interested. So it's a kind of subset of the overall group. But honestly, I've always said, these are my colleagues, many of them are my friends. I want to see them back in the Conservative Party, but they must demonstrate to the party, which is fair and reasonable, that they're on side.
You mentioned the Brexit Party there. Don't you think the truth is a clean no-deal Brexit is how you deal with the Nigel Farage problem? Do that, maybe win a majority of 40 to 60 according to the polls, and then spend the next 5 years tacking back into the middle ground. That's how you navigate into a majority Tory government.
I've already made it absolutely clear. I do not think the nonsense around no deal, as they call it, is correct. I've always thought we'll do perfectly well and we'll make our way in the world very happily as the fifth largest economy. Also, by the way, people forget the fifth largest export destination in the world and the biggest marketplace for the European Union. We have a lot of cards in our hands, which we've never played. The Prime Minister is setting out on a deal. All I'm saying is that deal, at the end of it, must meet the test of leaving without a deal, which is sovereign control over our nation's
And sovereignty is
elements.
That's always driven Boris Johnson on Brexit, isn't it? Not really immigration, where he's quite soft,
Absolutely.
But the idea of ECJ jurisdiction and sovereignty is what drove him.
Absolutely. And I think the EU would be sensible if they were to recognise that they want a good relationship with us afterwards, but they also recognise we need to demonstrate we've left. And I think the biggest point for them is very simply this. It's that if you keep seeking the deal that traps the UK, then you will force the UK to leave without a deal. So a real deal is sovereign power lays with the EU.
And they're seeing that, aren't they? Xavier Bettel's remarks saying it's not our fault, it's your fault. To a degree, do you think all the anger, the frustration in the EU, the Supreme Court and the ruling happening possibly Monday or Tuesday, it's a natural bringing together, it feels chaotic, but really this is always how it's going to end to get us out.
Yeah, I hope that the
a massive pile-up of constitutional
I hope
chaos.
the Supreme Court recognises the limitations of their reach and recognises they have no right to trespass on government's prerogative powers. Okay. Secondly, the European Union has got to recognise as well, categorically now, that they have to make a big decision. It's rather like being a row of houses. We want to move from being a terraced house to being a fully detached house. But it doesn't mean to say we don't get on with our neighbours. What they've tried to do is keep us semi-detached, and that's not going to work.
Ian Duncan-Smith, thank you for coming on Choppers Brexit Podcast.
Pleasure.
Ian Duncan-Smith might have his own ideas about navigating through this Brexit impasse, but what will Boris Johnson's advisors be telling him in number 10? Well, with me now is one man who has a wealth of experience in advising Prime Ministers about dealing with Parliament, Joe Moor. Now, Joe was Director of Legislative Affairs in number 10 Downing Street until July this year, so he knows plenty about advising a Prime Minister about dealing with difficult MPs. Joe, welcome to Red Lion Pub.
Thank you very much.
Are you a denizen of these premises? Are you?
I am. I've been here many times.
Yes, drowning your sorrows during the May years.
Yeah, and also
months.
It's actually my favourite pub in Westminster.
Is it?
Yeah, the beer is good. The company's good. You can stand outside and smoke.
Yes,
it suits me, all my purposes.
It's all
perfectly.
Here. And of course, your job in number 10. What was it? What were you doing when you were there?
So I initially went in as the sort of Deputy Director of Legislation under Nikki DaCosta.
Yep.
And then stood up into the role when she left and took that on full time.
And she's now advising the current
she's
PM.
Now gone back again, quite.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting role, and I think the title of it is probably misleading in some ways. So it's a lot more than legislation; it's also Parliament.
Yes. And normally that's a non-controversial job. Normally you're the guy who just gets things done and and you can probably go home at 5 o'clock and you see the family, and normally it's not really any drama, is it, that kind of role?
That sounds dreamy. I think with
in a normal
time,
it
would be easier. But the essential purpose of the role was created, and I think it was one of those things that was probably talked about for a long time, but then only actually happened when, after the 2017 election, when it became apparent how difficult the numbers in Parliament would be. And the essence of the role is sort of threefold, I suppose. One is you're responsible for delivering the Prime Minister's legislative agenda, ensuring that the priorities that they have put onto the statute book in the way that they want that to be done. The flip side of that is you're also in the room at the beginning of policy making. So you're the person that sits in the corner and says, this great idea that you've got that sounds amazing, it's never going to get through Parliament. You need to think about the numbers. And, one of my great bugbears and expressions that I probably became too well known for is, have we got a majority for this?
Yes. That's an annoying question when it's a very, very small majority.
When you strip it down to basics, that's the fundamental ask. Yes. And then the third strand to the role is probably slightly more generalist, because you sit in the top team at Downing Street that's responsible for setting the sort of strategy of government. And so a lot of your work is bartering with ministers and MPs and departmental spads, etc., just to try and push whatever the agenda happens to be. And the danger of Downing Street is it's very easy to get sucked into the moment rather than look forwards. So one of the disciplines that we always instilled was that, we try and spend a proportion of our time being proactive. But when you're in the middle of meaningful votes and everything else is, very difficult, it's very difficult to escape from that moment.
So you're there through all the MV 1, 2 and 3 and trying to get the numbers together.
Yeah.
But we are where we are, aren't we? If you were in number 10, what would you be advising the government to do? I noticed at the weekend in the Sunday Telegraph you raised the issue and you only said these are the options, not advocating any positions, but you could double prorogue, just come back with the Queen's speech and then prorogue again for 2 weeks and we leave while Parliament isn't sitting. These are options, aren't they?
I think there are options that are open. They're not any that I would necessarily advocate myself, as you say. I think what's happened over the summer has been, and the last few weeks especially, has been very damaging for our democracy. And I think what we've seen is an abuse of the prerogative power to prevent parliamentary scrutiny from taking place. That said, there are lots of options in play, and I think it's impossible to actually, you can draw the biggest mind map you want, and, if this, then that. But any flowchart's still going to have something that misses from it. What
would be your advice if you were number 10 right now and the PM said to you, Joe, do or die, I'm going to leave the EU by October 31st and you're going to make it happen? What would you say to him?
I think I'd say that wasn't possible.
Would you?
Yeah, I mean, you look at what's happened and take not only the obligations that the government is under with reporting under the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act, but also the...
that's reported every 2 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. From
so
the 9th
Parliament
of October
must be sitting, every 2 weeks.
Yeah, to try and put it as concisely as I can, there was an initial reporting requirement which required a motion after 5 days. That was dealt with early in September. The next reports fall due on the 9th of October, and a motion must follow 5 days later, which is presumably why the 14th has been allocated as the Queen's speech. And then from the 9th of October, every 14 calendar days thereafter, further reports have to be made on or before that date, and motions follow again
Which
within
means
5
it's hard
days.
to prorogue Parliament because it must be sitting on those days.
Well, that was the intention of the legislation, or the amendments to that legislation as it was drawn. And it's important to note that the legislation wasn't for that purpose.
No.
The legislation was purely for decision-making in Northern Ireland. But there are ways around it, as I highlighted in the article that I did for your paper.
You can push it out,
Sunday.
can't you, to November the 6th?
Yeah, you can move the reports, because the reports fall due on or before a certain date. You can essentially bank them early and then carry on for longer.
But it's a bad look, isn't it, a double prorogue? I mean...
But I think furthermore, there's a time constraint to the whole process. So I think most people will accept that a deal is unlikely to be agreed before European Council, which is the 17th and 18th of October. The Ben Act, which was passed to ensure that...
letter.
Yeah. The Ben Act's intention is essentially to stop no deal from happening on the 31st of October, not to stop it happening ever. Mm-hmm. You have to send that letter by the 19th if Parliament hasn't either agreed to a deal or expressly said it doesn't.
Asking for a delay. Yeah.
And to have an agreement at European Council to then move a motion before the 19th that satisfies the requirement of that act to not send the letter is incredibly tight.
Yes.
So, European Council is on the Thursday, Friday.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
Yes. Does that then mean Parliament's going to have to sit on the Saturday somehow, which means giving notice of the motions and things that you need to do beforehand? But the difficulty comes then of when do you move the motion, when do you table the motions, because you're not going to want to table them before European Council because you'll look too confident that you're going to secure something perhaps, and then there's very little wiggle room. And then say even hypothetically, say that's all fine and they do it on a Saturday and somehow it works and that's all lovely. And I desperately hope we do get a deal. But you've then got to legislate for it. The EU Withdrawal Act 2018, the original big one that everyone else, talks about as, cementing the whole process in legislation, doesn't fall away. You still have to have a meaningful vote, which the Ben Act's provisions wouldn't necessarily satisfy, although it could be flipped around. And you also have to legislate. You have to have this thing that has been called the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which essentially puts the withdrawal agreement onto our statute book. And to do that in whatever's left, 10, 11 days,
no time,
is phenomenally fast.
Yes.
And then at the same time, the European Parliament still has their processes that they have to go through.
Oh, God.
So the European Parliament at some point has to approve the withdrawal agreement.
Oh.
They would obviously want to do their scrutiny and due diligence on it,
There's
which
no
is
time, Joe.
right for them to do. And the clock is...
So you're a betting man. We are where we are. What are the odds on leaving on October 31st?
I think it's low.
Low. Joe Moore, thank you for coming to the Choppers Brexit Podcast. We'll hear from Bill Cash soon. He might disagree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, don't go anywhere. In just a moment, I'll be joined by a man who first became an MP in 1984 and has been a member of the European Scrutiny Committee ever since then. It must be a record. It's Sir Bill Cash. He's here right after this.
Hello, Chopper listeners. My name's Danny Boyle and I'm the Telegraph's Commuter Editions editor, which means it's my job to provide you with great journalism that makes your journey to and from work as enjoyable as possible. I can't prevent train delays or guarantee you won't get caught in the rain, but I can make sure you're up to date with the best of the Telegraph every morning and evening. And I just wanted to let you know about one of the ways you can get all that in audio form. All you need to do is join my WhatsApp group. Every weekday, my colleague Chris Price and I bring you short audio briefings directly to your smartphone at 8 in the morning and 5:30 in the afternoon. And the best bit, it's completely free to sign up and easy. Just click on the link in the show notes for this episode. I look forward to having you as a group member soon.
I'm joined now on Choppers Brexit Podcast by Sir Bill Cash, who I'm going to call the godfather of Brexit. You're the longest serving member of any select committee in history, I think, Bill, the European Scrutiny Committee. You first joined in 1985. So you know your onions about Brexit, don't you, and about the EU?
Well, I suppose inevitably, because the job of the Select Committee is to look into the European legislation. That means that we travel all over Europe talking to other countries as well, but also dealing with the domestic questions, both of policy, but also of law, because our standing orders give us the right to make our contributions and our observations on the legal and political position.
And you've met them all, haven't you? All of the Gisting and Delors. You met all of the senior founding fathers of the European Union. You've met them all, haven't you?
At one time or another. And actually also Helmut Schmidt, with whom I had a fascinating conversation back in the 1990s, and many others. So I've been very fortunate because it's given me an insight into their thinking as well as our own. My main concern has always been the ability of the British people to govern themselves in accordance with the votes they cast in general elections by secret ballot. That is our democracy. And then the members of Parliament who are selected in individual constituencies then end up by forming the government if they have a majority. Then we make the laws, and then it is properly democratic.
You've written into the Telegraph today, Thursday. Do you want us to summarise what you're saying there? You're concerned, aren't you, that Parliament essentially is taking over the forming and passing of laws from the government? It's almost a mini coup.
Well,
I described, not your word.
No, I said it was a travesty in the House of Commons. And I believe it is, because the decision under Standing Order 14, which when it was first originated, was to ensure that government business, which is based on general elections and the will of the people, shall prevail. So the government has the first precedence on business in the House of Commons. By tearing up Standing Order 14, and then deciding on bringing in legislation by private members' bills, taking precedence over government business, really means that they're completely taking control. And curiously enough, although I don't want to make too much of the historical analogy, this happened during Cromwell's time when there was a complete chaos. And he then came in and he said to them, "You have been here too long for anything useful you may have done. I say to you, depart. In the name of God, go."
Oh, my goodness.
And I was thinking this morning as I came through.
Past his statue, probably.
Past his statue. Yeah. And I thought to myself, what an extraordinary thing that the most iconic statue in the precincts of Parliament just outside is the very man who said, "I've had enough of you. You're not actually listening to the real arguments. What you're doing is coming up with a whole range of arguments, and you're effectively saying it's government by the people." When actually our parliamentary and constitutional system is based on a simple principle, which is parliamentary government, not government by Parliament.
I mean, I think you can think about the Civil War and having countrymen fighting countrymen over two different ways of running the country.
It's about who governs Britain, which is what I say.
And that's where we are now. And a lack of understanding the other side's argument is also quite similar.
I made that point in the debate the other day.
We are where we are. Brexit was within your grasp after all these decades on the European Scrutiny Committee, Bill Cash. You've been through the wording of the Ben law, which requires Boris Johnson to write a letter if he can't get a deal by the 18th, 19th of October. How do you think Boris Johnson, let's say he can't get a deal, how does he get from here to Brexit?
Well, the first point I'd make is that the statements that he's made are not in breach of the rule of law. The rule of law is that under the Withdrawal Act, which we've passed and got royal assent on the 26th of June 2018, it quite clearly states the European Community Act 1972 is repealed on exit day. Exit day is the 31st of October. That is the law of the land. This bill seeks an extension to the date of 31st of October, but there are a whole series of hoops that they have to go into before they get to the point of submitting a bill in order to give effect to the extension. So for practical purposes, it's by no means a slam dunk that they will get through the procedures in question.
And what are those then? Is it passing a new law to delay 31st?
Well, yes. And furthermore, too, they've also got to comply with certain conditions. So there are going to be a whole series of motions which have to take place beforehand. It is going to take time, and time is a most important question quite often in parliamentary proceedings.
So in that 10 days after the European Council, you're saying there needs to be a vote in Parliament and pass an amendment to change the law that we need to leave on October 31st?
It prescribes that the letter should be sent by the 19th of October, and then thereafter you go into the next question, which is the various hoops that have to be gone through.
Before 31st?
Yes, in order to get the law right. From their point of view, I think they're wrong, but as we speak, it is quite clear to me that the Prime Minister is completely right on this question of his being within the law, because the law is set out in the Withdrawal Act, and there is nothing in this bill which changes that,
so you can write,
except regarding the extension of time.
So you can write a letter, and if they grant an extension to March 31st, for example, next year, that then MPs then must pass a law to enact that before 31st to make it happen.
For practical purposes, that is the position.
Just from where we are now, what are the odds, do you think, on leaving on October 31st?
I think that they are good because this is the tide of public opinion.
In terms of can they do it, is there time allowed in parliamentary time to do all the things they need to do after letters are sent?
Well, something may depend on the question of whether or not the Supreme Court does decide that the prorogation was unlawful, because that would give them more time. I think that they've got real time constraints in doing it by the end of October anyway. But not only that, I think that it's justified. The prorogation, in my judgment, was justified. But having said that, I do think that one has to, as John Bercow referred to, that there might well be a great deal of creativity in procedural terms. And as I'm not quite sure what it is that they may have in mind, that is something we have to watch. But basically, I think that the people in question, and it's not just in the Conservative Party, it's throughout Parliament, have to have regard to what they're really doing, which is effectively trying to stop Brexit. Yeah. And when you cut to the chase, that is completely contrary to the democratic decisions that have been taken by the people, and entirely contrary to the decisions that have been taken already by Parliament as expressed in Acts of Parliament, which is the law of the land.
So Bill Cash, I'll say it again, the godfather of Brexit. Thank you for coming into Chopper's Brexit podcast.
Very good to speak to you.
Now this week, party conference season kicked off in Bournemouth with the Lib Dem conference. And I am joined now by a very old friend of mine, a journalist who's still got sand in her shoes. It's my great pleasure to have on Chopper's Brexit podcast my old friend, a great friend, Miranda Green, the Deputy Opinion Editor at the FT.
Hello, Chris.
Welcome to the Red Lion Pub.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be in this basement with you.
Normally we're side by side doing the paper review on the BBC.
I know. And it's been a week of contrasts because I spent the first 2 days in sunny Bournemouth.
Yes.
And now here we are back in the middle of...
in this hobbit-like dungeon.
Crowded hobbit-like Westminster. Yeah. And I really struggle to understand why politics can't all be done at the seaside.
Yes, I know. Did you go swimming?
Absolutely.
Did you? Was it warm?
Delicious water. Warm. It was just right.
Yes, I'll be swimming next week at the Labour conference off the pier.
The sea in Brighton.
It's a steep dive into the water. But did it clear your head? Did you understand the Lib Dem's Brexit policy any less than I do?
Okay, so the Lib Dem policy was a second referendum on Brexit in which they would be stridently arguing for Remain.
Totally get that. That's
incredibly clear.
Understood.
When the votes were going through Parliament, they also backed the SNP move, Joanna Cherry, who's their constitutional, to revoke Article 50 if it came to a sort of last-minute standoff between a no-deal Brexit and actually just revoking cancel.
That was the first move towards this position.
I think that gave them the idea that maybe revoke would be a sort of even clearer anti-Brexit message. So at the conference, they voted through, overwhelmingly, I should say, although with some dissent, going to a position which is, in a general election, they would stand on a manifesto of revoking Article 50, and then, therefore, if they were elected as the majority government, they would just cancel Brexit. Right. Of course, that's not going to happen.
No.
So you then have to go on and explain that they're still backing a second referendum and working with the other parties. In my view, any policy that you have to explain when it was very simple, questionable move.
It's not clear. So it's a two-stage policy, isn't it? If Jo Swinson becomes the PM, she will revoke Article 50, but if she doesn't, she'll back a second referendum.
That's right. And we should say that all the conversations that are going on between all the Remainy parties, including Labour, even though Labour's position is much more ambiguous, those are still very much ongoing. And it doesn't mean that the Lib Dems are any happier about, for example, in the event of a hung parliament propping up a Corbyn government, they're very strong that they would not do that.
Yes.
They've got to keep to that line, Chris, because think of all those moderate voters who are scared of Corbyn.
They have to, don't they?
Oh, my goodness, you cannot
But they're doing well, though, aren't they? I mean, a third of their MPs weren't Lib Dems at the start of the Parliament. They are now Lib Dem MPs. They've switched across. I mean, on the radio, David Cameron and I think Tony Blair, I heard bits of it, were saying, where do young people go now if they're moderate left-wingers, which is where New Labour used to be?
Totally. And I think there's a real opportunity for the Lib Dems. I mean, twice this week there have been academic reports on how chunky that centre block is. It's around about 40% of the electorate. I think the interesting question is, can you take a quite extreme position on Brexit and appeal to the moderates in the middle, But actually, the polling seems to show that whilst people are very polarised on Remain versus Leave, on a lot of other policies, people are still in the middle, So it's the parties that have gone to each side, not the voters.
It's very hardly a new party, so perhaps Lib Dems will hoover that up.
They hope to.
I heard Norman Lamb, who's leaving the party, talking against this policy, wasn't he, at the party conference. Paddy Ashdown famously said, we will abide by the result, whatever happens. It is a bit anti-democratic, isn't it, to cancel a vote?
So their argument is that if you win a general election from being a third minor party, that would be such a massive swing that it would be a clear message from the electorate and that you would then have a mandate to revoke. I mean, it's not particularly solid ground in my view because, these days you can win actually for the last three decades, right, you can win a majority in the House of Commons on 30-odd% of the vote.
Yes.
Is that really a mandate to overturn
Brexit,
52%
Brexit trickles down the list of important issues in an election.
Yeah, of
Schools,
course.
transport, health, everything else matters more.
That's very true. Although I would say that the blame should be shared equally on trying to pretend that a general election would only be a mandate for Brexit. Because what if we do have an election in the next few weeks in which a Boris Johnson Conservative Party is trying to claim that would be a mandate for pushing through no deal? I mean, you're quite right. People's motivations on how they vote in a general election can be all over the place.
Yeah, and hard to pin one reason why people vote for anything. It's a huge blancmange of shoehorning into a little pipe.
That's very true.
Does that make sense?
The other thing, I think shoehorning into a funneling all the motivations into one little.
Yes, you're with me.
Should we go with the funnel? There's another problem with the Lib Dem position, which is Scotland.
Yes.
Jo Swinson's seat is quite vulnerable to the SNP.
What's the majority? Do you know that?
I don't know that. I should know that, and I don't. Anyway, East Dunbartonshire, she's under real pressure from the SNP. If the Lib Dems are arguing nationally that if they win parliamentary seats in a general election, it's a mandate to overturn a referendum result, well, what about the SNP? Why should they not argue the same? That if they get most of the seats in Scotland after a general election, they just ignore the independence referendum. Exactly.
Because they're in her face all the time.
She's a strong unionist.
Yeah. What's the majority? Looking up, thank you, Theo. 5,300 majority. That's in range. I mean, and is she at risk, you think, Jo Swinson, of this way of being targeted by the SNP in a way that Tim Farron had to keep going back to Kendal and the Lakes to hold on to his seat because he was getting a real hard time from the Tories. The same way the SNP might drag her back all the time to Scotland so she can't campaign nationally at an election.
That's their plan. And also they've got quite a slightly unpleasant sort of whispering campaign against her and her personality, which isn't all that pleasant.
No.
But I think Scottish politics, since the referendum has become a pretty brutal affair. But actually on that question of Jo Swinson and her kind of general appeal, I thought she did do quite well this week. It's her first leader's speech. I mean, you and I know, Chris, we're both fans of Strictly.
Yes.
She's got, when the judges say, I like your attack.
Yes.
She's got that kind of, she's up for the fight, isn't she?
She's up for it,
which against two kind of
men,
slightly eccentric middle-aged chaps is not a disadvantage. She's got to watch it on the language. Yesterday she accused Jeremy Corbyn of betrayal. You've got to be so careful.
Yes.
We've had on one side judges as enemies of the people, crush the saboteurs.
Treason,
now we've got traitors,
liars.
Treason.
These are big words.
Everybody needs to calm down and de-escalate because we've got a very divided country. And I think Norman Lamb, who you mentioned earlier, I agree with Norman. We've got to think about how we get out of this morass because everyone in this country's got to live together when Brexit's done.
He's a big loss to the party.
He is.
Finally, it's now Thursday and David Cameron's admitting he asked the Queen to intervene during Indy Ref 1. I think that's a disaster, doing that, don't you think?
Yes.
Because when it happened as quite naturally she left the church, the Crathy Kirk, a week before the vote in 2014, and then just said people should think very carefully, to a well-wisher who reported it to an agency reporter who then fed it out to the world. And I was in Edinburgh at the time covering it for the Telegraph, and we thought it was an amazing moment. But the fact that she was asked to do it really is a problem, I think.
I think it comes across as a disrespectful thing to do, both in terms of his respect for the monarchy as a being above politics. Quite. It comes across as disrespectful to the electorate in Scotland trying to take a mature view on an important issue of their future. And it means that there'll be mistrust next time if we have a second Indy referendum.
Whenever she says anything, if she says anything in the Queen's speech, anything, they'll wonder if she's been lent on by the Prime Minister.
And she is always absolutely impeccable.
Yeah.
And it's outrageous for him to drag her into this.
Miranda Green, can I say thank you for coming to the Red Line Pub?
No, thank you,
Do you want some
Chris.
breakfast?
No, I've got a lovely cup of tea and a biscuit. I'm very happy.
Do come back again.
I will.
Well, that's your lot for today. Thank you to my guests Ian Duncan-Smith, Joe Moore, Sir Bill Cash, and of course Miranda Green. Thanks also to the podcast producers, Theo Laludis and Elliot Lampitt. For more agenda-setting Brexit news and analysis, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get 30 days access to the Telegraph online completely free of charge. If you want to get in touch with us, tweet us at Brexit Broadcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. Thank you to Two-Tongue Ted from Teddington. I do know that name is from the famous song Ernie the Fast Milkman in the West by Benny Hill, who left us a review on Apple Podcast this week. Please do go there and read Two-Tongue Ted from Teddington's review and give us 5 stars. It really helps people find this show. But always, always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. It's brilliant. Until next time, cheerio!
Do you have a friend who never pays their share of the bill? Or are your parents wasting your inheritance on flash cars and Caribbean cruises? Or maybe you have 2 children, but you can only afford to send one to a fee-paying school.
The common thread? Money, and the moral problems that it so often leaves in its wake.
I'm Lauren Davidson.
And I'm Sam Meadows.
We both report on personal finance for The Telegraph. And each week on our podcast, Moral Money, we're joined by one of our paper's best-loved columnists to unpick the thorny financial issues sent in by listeners.
From stretching your work expenses to the ethics of paying less tax, this is the ultimate guide to what's okay and what's not in the blurred world of money morals.
It's heated.
It's lively.
And it might even help you become a better person.
Search for Moral Money in your favourite podcast app and click subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode.